We have a long name. It's a Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. I think just having the word radical makes people curious. So a lot of folks come on the tour trying to understand what we mean by the word radical. Radical for us really means stories of organizing and activism. On the tour, we tell stories of queer organizing. We tell stories of young people organizing after 9/11, folks organizing against the emergency in India, which was in the 1970s. And we also share stories of oppression that happens within our own community. Stories related to caste and class oppression that happened right here in the city of Berkeley. In my experience, when somebody meets me, the only thing they want to know is like, oh, what's a good Indian restaurant that we should eat at? And at some point, having learned all of these other stories about my community, I was like, I'm not going to tell you that until you come on the tour. You have to learn about our radical legacy before I tell you where you can get good food. And it's another sort of attempt at pushing back against the stereotype, the model minority stereotype of our communities. One of my favorite stories is definitely the story of the first South Asian protest that happened in Berkeley, and that was in 1908. It's based on a newspaper article about these 17 students. These students could have been from anywhere, India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. And it's a story of them confronting an evangelical preacher who was basically justifying colonialism by saying that the religion of India was at fault and therefore justified the British being there in order to rescue the natives. Many people know of Berkeley as the birthplace of the free speech movement. A lot of people will talk about Berkeley's radical legacy as if it started in the 1960s. What this shows us is that Berkeley's radical legacy goes back much further. It includes the stories of people like these students who confronted a racist speaker. And we want Berkeley's radical legacy to be inclusive of those stories. Both of us are community organizers and activists. We found that a lot of South Asians didn't necessarily see themselves as organizers or activists, especially in the US. And as you know, a lot of South Asia, like we've fought colonialism. In Bangladesh, there's been like a whole war for independence. All of us have come through some form of activism and organizing that has gained us our freedom. To come here and then not remember that legacy seemed really sad and unfortunate. We were at that same time talking to people about organizing and activism that hadn't happened in the homeland, but it happened right here where we live. And especially it happened right here in Berkeley. And to know that those stories go back over 100 years, it was quite stunning. I found myself often thinking, is Berkeley home? Is this where I want to live forever? We sort of thought about all of those things, how do we create a sense of home for people here? How do we educate people about the place that they live in? Now, of course, the challenge with that is a lot of these places that we talk about don't really exist. Places that are important to us were not considered important to the majority white community as places that needed to be preserved. We had to come up with ways to bring these places alive for people. And one of the ways we do that is by doing role-playing and also by doing theater on the streets. For that moment, you create a memory and a sense of place for the participants on the tour so that the next time they're walking by that spot, there may not be a marker or a plaque or anything there, but the fact that they've seen us perform a certain story at that place will evoke a memory for them and basically change the way they walk in the city. In October 2019, the city of Berkeley decided that they wanted to rename 2 blocks in downtown Berkeley, and they asked for nominations from the community. When this opportunity came up, we thought this would be a great way to use the street naming opportunity to talk about our 100+ year history of South Asians and Asian Americans in the city of Berkeley. There's no dearth of names that we could have suggested, but immediately when we were sort of going down our list of names, Kalabagai really stood out to me. She and Vaishno immigrated here to the US in 1915 with their 3 kids, and she became one of the earliest South Asian immigrants, women, to move here. The reason they were moving here was to escape British colonialism. Vaishno wanted to work with the Ghadar Party, which was an anti-colonial movement of farmers and students working in diaspora to take down the British. And a couple of years later, they wanted to move to a house in Berkeley. And this is the part of the oral interview that really shook me, and it really stuck with me.
We bought a house in Berkeley. English people were there. And so our house, we paid for it, and we went inside, they locked the doors. They wouldn't let us in because we were from India. I said, I don't want to live in this neighborhood. I don't want to live in this house because they might hurt my children.
You know, her saying this in that oral interview, it stuck with me, and it kind of haunted me, because it brings up a lot of memories of immigrants trying to find home in the US, and brings up memories of some of the interpersonal racism that our communities have faced after 9/11, for example. Her life would go on to take another tragic turn when Vaishno, who had become a citizen in the early 1920s, would then go on to lose his citizenship, would go on to lose sort of the business they had set up in San Francisco, and he would feel like a person in a gilded cage. He felt very trapped, and he ended up taking his own life. Kala survived that, and she would go on to become a community builder. Before that, she would send her sons through college. She would remarry, which was still pretty taboo among our community. And she would create for other immigrants a welcoming place. In more recent renamings, you might think of somebody who's really famous, somebody who's won some kind of award or political office, and definitely somebody who lived in the city for some time, had a strong connection to the city. And what we were suggesting is this idea that we needed to honor the people that our city had kept out. The street renaming process started around October 2019. We worked very closely with the Bagai family, because it's really important that the family has buy-in. What we worked to do was to share Kalabagai's story with a larger audience. So we did a lot of op-eds, we did a letter writing campaign. We worked with a lot of our community members, whether they were parents or students at UC Berkeley, folks from our indigenous community. Ultimately, that is what caused the city council to make the decision, because they saw this outpouring of public support for this name, not just from South Asians, but from the larger community, which is what led to their decision then in September 2020 to rename the street after Kalabagai. The street sign would finally go up on this rainy day in February. It was almost like Kala was making her presence known. That as if she was blessing us. The rain could not dampen our euphoria at finally seeing the street sign unveiled. The street is now just part of our infrastructure. Anirvan and I both get a little tickled every time we see just the address coming up in some normal conversation. In some ways, that's how our stories should be integrated into our cities and into our lives. They don't always have to be special. We also get to be just normal parts of our communities and the places we live in.